Hey y'all, this is Daniel Moeller. Welcome to Psychonaut Sessions, your home for all things psycho. Today I would like to do an extensive book review of the Deathgate Cycle book series by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. But first and foremost, I do want to just briefly promote my latest issue of my comic book series, the Simon Myth Chronicles Broken Chalice. Is available for orders. If you would like to order from me directly and get a signed copy, please message me. You can message in the comments, or you can direct message me through my email, dmoeller777@gmail.com. And I would be more than happy to share this series with you. It's very close to my heart. I'm having a great time building this series out over the last couple of years, and will continue to do so. I don't really have any plans for an end to this series. Yes, well, no, let me recap. I definitely have plans for an end to this series. I just don't know how long it's going to take. It might be 6 issues. It might be 8 issues, 10. Who knows? Who knows? So please go out to danielmoellerweb.com and you can find numerous links to other products, including right now during the holiday season, my merch is available at a discounted price. So for the past few years, I've been reading multiple things, but for about, well, I would say about a year and a half to 2 years, I decided that I wanted to read the Deathgate Cycle series. It's a 7-book series by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Created and from the years of 1990 through 1994, and it was hot off of the heels of their work for Dragonlance. So Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman are very close and near dear to my heart because Dragonlance Chronicles to me is one of the greatest fantasy epics of all time. Maybe that's just because I grew up reading it. It is really probably the only book that I have read multiple times over and plan to keep reading it multiple times. It just gets better and better. It tugs at my heartstrings every time. The characters are some of the most rich characters, probably in all fiction, in my humble opinion. And it's kind of your run-of-the-mill fantasy, but it's just the way that the characters interact and are built out is just amazing. So if you haven't read this isn't a review for Dragonlance Chronicles, but if you haven't read it, I highly recommend the Dragonlance Chronicles and the subsequent trilogy that came out of this, Legends. So wonderful fantasy epics if you're into fantasy. So it was this series that really propelled Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman to fame. And they created another fantasy series, I think, called the Dark Sword Trilogy. I haven't read it. But there was another series called the Deathgate Cycle that they came out. And they really wanted to kind of do their best to reinvent the fantasy genre and create something new and different. But just as extensive in world building as their Dragonlance stuff. Because when they wrote the Dragonlance Chronicles, they were really building that particular world out because it was based upon the Dungeons and Dragons fantasy game, and they were creating a whole different module for Dragonlance for that. And they kind of wanted to do the same thing, but on their own and in their own way that wasn't tied to any trademark. And funny enough, I actually read the Deathgate Cycle Book 2 in high school. It was recommended to me by a friend, and I don't know why it wasn't recommended for me to read Book 1. And really, you'll kind of understand as we go through the books why, like, you can kind of read the first few maybe on their own and not necessarily in sequential order. But as I kind of went through it, it does seem to be kind of like a good idea. But it was enough to intrigue me. I read it in high school, and I didn't understand entirely what was going on, but I don't know. It just intrigued me. I enjoyed it, and it always stuck out in my mind as something that I wanted to revisit and read the entire series. And it was a bucket list item for me. So I said about a couple of years ago that I wanted to finish the series finally. And I started it, and yeah, it took me about a year and a half or so to get through the full series. Again, had a lot going on. I've had like kids graduating high school and stuff. It's not that it normally takes me that long to read, but and reading other things and creating stuff as well. It's just one of those things that I didn't push myself. I did it when I had the time to do it. All right. Without further ado, let me get into this. So I'm going to go through the books briefly, real quick, and then and keep it as non-spoiler as possible. And then I'll definitely start letting you, as the audience, know when I'm going to get into spoiler territory. So the Deathgate cycle, first and foremost, starts in Dragonwing. Now, the whole concept of this, and they lay the groundwork of the book series from the very beginning, is that there used to be one world. And they're not shy about the fact that that one world used to be Earth, probably, most likely. They throw hints out, so you're like, is it? But, I mean, they're not really hiding the fact that it used to be Earth. And there were two races of demigods called the Sartan and the Patrins that were at war with one another. And through that war, the Sartans decided to sunder the world, rip it to shreds, and break it out into 4 different worlds based upon the elements: earth, air, fire, water. And they imprisoned the Patrins, their enemies, in this kind of world that's more like a limbo sort of world. It's like a half world called the Labyrinth. And it's basically this prison world where they're meant to rehabilitate because they saw the patrons as being evil. And if they were able to rehabilitate, they would be able to live in another world that was separate from the 4 worlds called the Nexus. So you've got all these different worlds that they broke out Earth into. And so the first 4 books actually go through the 4 worlds. You start out from the very beginning. The main hero, whose name is Haplo, he is a Patron. So he's one of those races of demigods that were imprisoned, that lost and were imprisoned in the labyrinth. And his lord, his master, helps get his race of people out of the labyrinth into the Nexus and plotting their revenge against the Sartan. And in order to do that, he has sent Haplo out to explore the 4 worlds to gather intelligence, to find out what life is like among all the denizens, to instill chaos in all the worlds, to make it hard for the Sartan, and find out what the Sartan are up to. So that's the whole basic concept, and it's set up like pretty quickly, so you know what you're getting into in the beginning of Dragonwing. None of that is spoiler territory at all. And so book 1 is purely about the world Arianus, which is the world of air. And it's basically a world that is broken up into all of these continents that float in space. And so Haplo's main goal is to explore this world, and ends up finding out that the people of these worlds are broken up into 3 different races: humans, elves, and dwarves. And the patrons and the Sartan refer to these races as Mensch, which is kind of like a derogatory term. It's a way to denote that they're lesser than the patrons or the Sartan and their magic. And so in the first book, he explores the world of air, encounters different characters, including a character named Alfred, who is a very interesting character that has a lot of magic. And was sort of a monk-like character who's taking care of a young prince named Bane. Bane is the prince of a king who is in the midst of multiple wars actually going on in this world. A lot of complex political stuff happening in this particular world. And Bane is actually the result of the king hiring an assassin named Hugh the Hand to kill his own son, to kill Bane. So Haplo gets mixed up in all of this, including a political revolution going on with the dwarves, who live in this machine called the Kixie Windsy. And this machine is this giant complex that's probably the size of a city or more. that's meant to make water and get water, because there's very little water on this world. A lot of the continents are very barren. And so the whole goal of this machine is to make water, and they make water for the elves. So the elves, humans, and dwarves, there's all this political stuff where they're fighting for this natural resource. They hate each other. They look upon each other, in derogatory ways as well. So, Haplo gets all mixed up into this. And a lot of these characters are introduced, which may or may not have some impact later in the series. So, pretty well self-contained, though, and a really good book. It was a lot of fun. Breeze through it. Elven Star, this was fun to reread, but I found upon my reread of it, since this was the first book that I read, it's an interesting concept, but some of the characters were actually a little annoying. So Haplo goes to the world of Prion. And Prion is the sun world, or not the sun world, but the world of fire, which is weird because it's all a giant jungle. The way this world is set up is actually fairly interesting because it's hollow. It's a hollow world, and the denizens all live in like the inner shell of this world, and there are 4 hot suns burning in the middle, and it's so hot that it causes all of this, like the whole world, to be overrun completely with vegetation. So much so that the trees are so big that all of the mensch, all of the denizens of this world, live amongst all of these trees. And these trees are so big that one branch could be the size of a city. It's gigantic. So the world here is really cool, really interesting. Some of the characters in this world were just kind of like, okay, whatever. One thing I failed to mention is Haplo is usually accompanied by this little dog that just kind of showed up in his life. And this dog is this like constant little companion that he has. That's a lot of fun throughout the series. One thing that gets introduced in this book that's very important to the rest of the books is a wizard named Zifnab. And what's interesting about this character is that if you change the letters around of Zifnab, it's an anagram, you would get the name Fizbin, which is the name of the wizard in Dragonlance Chronicles. And they're very similar characters, like very much like, weird wizards that are like, kind of like they have dementia and they're kooky and funny and stuff. So he gets introduced as an important character in this, and that's probably one of the more important pieces of this book. The antagonists in this book are these giant monsters called the Titans, which were actually really cool and fun as well. One thing about these books that you start realizing is that these, even though the covers look pretty basic, these worlds that they've built out are very well realized, very well constructed. And in fact, the way this book series is constructed is that they have appendices in the back that further flesh out the worlds themselves, including having songs and stuff with sheet music accompanied. So, I mean, given Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman props for, they weren't being lazy about this. There's a lot of material in this. So that's book 2, Elven Star. Book 3, as you can see and could probably guess, is the world of fire, dubbed Fire Sea. And this world's actually interesting because it is deep within the earth. So it's another world that is, I think, coated in ice, and then it's all caverns underneath that ice. And so it's all underground. And this book took a really weird, dark turn because it's a world that is rife with people who have taken up necromancy. And it's full of zombies and all like it just was like, what? This was like a crazy turn. And things got like really dark, including Haplo and other characters that have been introduced in the series start really begin to like jump into conflict. Elven Star seems kind of isolated from the rest of the series, where he's not really interacting with other characters throughout the series. This book, they really start to conflict and interact, and like things start getting to move a little bit. There's still some like stuff in this that's singular to this book. Very interesting concept, but personally, I was ready to get out of the underground in this book. I've read the Dark Elf series by R.A. Salvatore. A lot of that takes place in the Underdark. It's weird. I'm experiencing my claustrophobia within my reading. But that underground is just so rich and full of life and all sorts of just interesting stuff. The underground here is just like death, gory death. It's just like, it's suffocating. And I think that was part of the point. I think that's part of what they were going for. So that's book 4, or book 3, I'm sorry. Book 4 is Serpent Mage. This takes place in the world of Chalestra. Oh, that previous world was the world of Abarak. This is the world of Chalestra. It's the world of water. And it's all water. It's this giant globe of water, and the continents reside in these like little air pockets, these air bubbles. A lot of interesting turns. Like things really start kicking up in this book. That start contributing to the overall story. The first 3 books can feel very isolated sometimes, and like, where's the overarching story coming in? They're planting seeds in these first 3 books, and they're all enjoyable in their own right. But this one really starts kicking up. Hoplo's character and really starts understanding his like own humanity in this. You start really seeing a shift in his story arc in this book. And then there's other characters in this book that have long-lasting consequences for the rest of the series, that have major arcs in this book as well. And yeah, the whole climate of the situation in this story really starts to shift in this book. So really, really good stuff, including like the primary antagonists for like the whole series, like the main bad guy sort of presence, like gets introduced in this book as well. And it's a very fun, interesting concept. So Serpent Mage, really good one. And then those are the first 4. Each of those take place in each of the 4 realms. And then you get the final 3 books, which is Hand of Chaos, Into the Labyrinth, and Seventh Gate. And each of these specifically, these take place a lot back on the world of Arianis, a little bit in some other parts of the worlds, but Arianis is a big focus, especially in Hand of Chaos, or Hand of Chaos. And Into the Labyrinth, you eventually, not like all the way through the book, but partway through the book, there's an entrance into the world of the Labyrinth, and you get to know that a little bit more, which is that prison world for the patrons. Things are pretty good here, and then it all ends with Seventh Gate. And so I don't know how to get into this without getting into spoilers, but the main storyline really starts kicking in these books. I would say that for my own personal taste, without getting into spoilers, the story was good. I liked it. I was a little disappointed in the end, in the sense that it just seemed to wrap up pretty quickly. It kind of felt like throughout the series that they were submitted into a book contract for 7 books, and they really needed to fill in some space in some of these books. So each book has about 100 pages or so where I'm like, is this really necessary? And there were some cases where like the action isn't really even part of the story. A lot of the action is happening like outside of it, battles and things like that, and you hear the characters just talking about it. And those are some times when I felt I had some complaint. Not that I need my books to be all actiony and everything, but it felt like sometimes the story was happening outside of them a little bit in some cases. So that was kind of another, complaint of mine. And these 2 books, I really felt that as like more so than any of the others. I felt come on, like this is supposed to be the main part of the story, and there's a lot of pages that I'm going through where I'm just, let's go, let's kick it up, like we're getting to the end here. And then disappointed by the last book because it's actually the smallest of all the books, and everything just kind of ends. I really think that these two could have just even been one book, and it could have been a 6-book series. Cut just a tad out of this and then added this, and it would have worked. Overall, I'm really happy that I read the book series. Very satisfied with the reading. Again, a little disappointed by the end. I felt like it was a little rushed. It was a little trite too, in that just like everything just ended kind of perfectly. Which, I mean, I think that's what you're getting into with Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. And if I think about like the Chronicles and what I've read of theirs, their stuff's kind of like that. They're kind of like the Steven Spielbergs of fantasy. It's not bad. You know what you're getting. It's good popcorn stuff, and there's some feels, but everything's going to end up okay in the end. So you really shouldn't expect anything less. So other than those like few complaints and just feeling like they could have pulled out, like, I mean, when you get Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, you get good characters. There's good characters in this. The only other complaint I think that I probably have is a lot of the world building too and explanatory pieces were in the appendices and also in footnotes, which kind of broke up the reading of the text. And also, by the time I got done with the book, I was like, do I really want to read the appendix? It's really cool stuff. They got a lot of really cool things, like diagrams on how things work, on how the magic works. But you have to read those things in order to understand what's going on in the story, because by the time you're fully into those 3 books, they're just kind of talking about the way some of these characters are working their magic, and it almost seems generic if you hadn't read some of those appendices and know how it works. So that was kind of a complaint. I feel like they could have pulled that into the narrative itself, and I think it also would have made it a little bit more exciting. Because again, sometimes when they would refer to those things, it seemed a little ambiguous or generic or whatever. Okay, so I think that's spoiler free. I hope. Gosh. But I highly recommend it if you want a fantasy series that's different and has like a different feel, and a different structure to it. And also something that is just going to be fun. It's just all around like, cartoon fantasy kind of, but has some dark pieces in it. I mean, it's a good series. Deathgate Cycle. I always applaud Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Now getting into spoiler territory a little bit. So, caution spoilers. There were some parts about the characters that I love the characters, but there were some things about the narrative that really bugged me, in the sense that they seem to not really make sense with some of their decisions. So, for instance, in the first book, you're introduced to Haplo, you're introduced to Alfred. You find out later that Alfred is actually a Sartan. And so Haplo and Alfred have all this conflict. They keep getting bumped into one another throughout the series, and they eventually grow into a friendship. Of course, and the 2 of them are really the heroes of the entire series, not just Haplo. But there are so many cases throughout the first few books where when he finds out Alfred is a Sartan, and as much hatred as these patrons have for the Sartan, why wouldn't he have just killed him outright? There are so many times whenever he comes up with reasons to maybe keep him alive or to keep other people alive. And the same thing happens with other characters. You get introduced to more Sartan later in the books, and they're really vicious. You get introduced, of course, to Haplo's Lord. His name is Lord Zar, who ends up being one of the prime antagonists. And they keep finding reasons to not just like take care of someone that's a nuisance or kill them or whatever. There's always some kind of strategic reason as to why I'm going to keep this person around or why I'm going to keep hanging around this person. But when you think about it, like logically, it's like, really? Why? Like, and they end up not really needing that person really in the end. That's a storytelling device that really starts dragging on me in the series, or really drug on me specifically in the series. That was just like, come on, you guys are obviously just moving the story along. Haplo, for being the primary protagonist, he was like the Bruce Willis or the Jean Grey, if you know that reference in X-Men of the series, and that almost every single book he is imprisoned or incapacitated or unconscious, and you get whole areas of the book where he's just sitting there staring up at a ceiling, and it's just like, really? Like, and you don't really get that, like, it's set up that he's this amazing magician and warrior and a total badass, which is why he's chosen out of all of his race to go explore, but you don't like really get to see him in action making really smart decisions and really being a badass much. He really gets his ass handed to him a lot, and he really keeps finding himself in situations where he doesn't have a whole lot of control, and it just becomes this confusing mess. Really, I think the highlight of the series ends up being Alfred, the character that gets introduced, what you think is a human in the first book, and then you find out is a Sartan, mainly because he is just such a flawed character to begin with. And he's fun. He's one of those characters that, like, you would only want Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman to write, because they have a way of making a character fun, but also like consistent in how that person would react to situations. And that might get repetitive for a while, but it's like, it's very realistic as to who that person is. And yes, their characters have growth, but their characters don't change character. That person is still that person, even though they've had some character growth. So, for instance, I may, and just like with Alfred, I may overcome some insecurity in my life, but I still may be kind of like a bumbling, like, whatever. That's like Alfred's story, essentially. Because that's what people do. It's not like, oh, you've overcome your insecurity, or you've looked at the dark part of yourself, so suddenly you're just Superman. That's not the way things happen. So that I appreciate. One of the bigger complaints I had towards the final books itself, I think I was just expecting more of the final story and the final conflict. The head of the Sartan ends up actually getting killed off in Hand of Chaos, like at the very beginning. So that's like the main conflict, is between the head of the Sartan and the head of the Patrons. And it makes an interesting twist in that the head of the Patrons, then Lord Zar, Haplo's lord, kind of becomes the antagonist. And what gets introduced in book 4 are these giant serpents that start invading all the realms, that are really kind of just a reflection of the shadow of humanity, the shadow of the Sartans and the Patrons, representing their hubris, their fear. So that's a common theme that really gets hit on through the books and the decisions that the people are making. And you kind of see Lord Zar develop into a villain in these final books as a result. But again, like, Lord Zar, like, probably is the most vicious out of all of these people. But there's so many cases where he just encounters, like, even just totally annoying people that have no bearing to the story. They're not needed at all. And they're in his way. He's annoyed by them. And normally you would, by the way you're introduced to his character, he would just kill them outright for no reason. But he finds some lame reason to keep them around. And it never works out to any kind of true storytelling device or anything. It's just like, come on, like make this guy a little bit more, this doesn't need to be happening. And what happens, especially in these two books, is he just ends up following around these people in the world of Priyan for really no reason at all. and being around them. And there's a storytelling piece of those characters from Priyan that's just, where is this going? None of this means anything at all, and it doesn't end up having any bearing for the rest of the book series. So anyway, what's interesting about all of the books, though, is there's this idea of the patrons and the Sartan being demigods and treating themselves as the gods of the universe. And they're at war. And the Mensch seeing them almost as these gods. So you get this really cool history and legacy and the way people see the other races. But there's this idea that gets introduced, probably book 3. I think, yeah, it's book 3, where there's the reference of a higher power, even of them. And actually, if you know the Dragonlance history, that gets introduced in book 2 when Zifnab the wizard gets introduced, because you know what he represents in Dragonlance. He's kind of like a representation of that higher power, so on and so forth. And that becomes this like theme of like there's this higher power guiding everything and guiding these characters into the decisions that they're making. There's some prophetic angles that keep coming up, ra-ta-ta-ta-ta, that, you know, move them along in the story. So you're like, okay, it's building up to this, like, there's going to be this bigger, higher thing and whatnot. And in this one, once you get through the final, I wouldn't even say final battle, but just final conflict in the final book, within a chapter or two, it's all just kind of explained very briefly. And Zifnab the wizard is, you know, if you've watched Dragonlance Chronicles, again, this is major spoilers, claims to be the god, but also claims that, like, everybody's god. Like, we're all gods, and we're all gods creating this, and then it just kind of drops, and then that's it. And I guess that's supposed to kind of explain how all of these things happened that were kind of confusing. And that was just kind of like, ugh. And it makes sense when I know Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. They are major Mormons, which, like, Dragonlance Chronicles is basically like the Mormon cosmology. And this kind of is a little bit too. And there is this notion, if you really dive deep into the Mormon religion, and I only know this really truly because a really good friend of mine used to be a Mormon priest. Doesn't have anything against them. He just doesn't want to be a priest anymore, and he's walked away, and he's not religious anymore, but he doesn't have anything negative against the Mormons. But there's this concept that, like, we all are actually gods ourselves, creating this and making this happen, which is like a very strong Hindu concept, Buddhist concept, and when you do psychedelics, that's like what you see. You know, it's a very, you know, common trope, but it's just kind of like thrown in there at the very end, really quick. Everything just gets tied up too neatly within just a chapter or two, and then boom, it's just done. So yeah, I mean, I love this book series, but I can't express enough. I was kind of disappointed. I wanted more. I wanted more of a conflict. I wanted more of, like, understanding whatever this higher presence is, or the way that higher world works. And they kind of explain that in the appendices, but, like, I don't want to read an encyclopedia, right? That's the way they kind of are. I don't want to read an encyclopedia. I wanted to read that in story. And I wanted to experience it rather than it just being told to me, and then also just kind of wrapped up real quick in the end. So I am kind of disappointed with the ending. Was it still worth reading the whole thing? Absolutely. It was still worth it, because it's just, I mean, for one, since I aim to be a completist, so I've read the whole series, and there was some good things in this too. I don't want to disparage it, because Alfred's story, Haplo's story, their friendship, the way it builds after having so many books of conflict between them, is really great to watch and experience. So, yeah, other than that, I don't want to go into any more like detailed tears because I just finished it and I probably need some more time to process. But also, it's like, you can nitpick certain books forever, and what's the point? Did you like it or didn't you like it? And I liked it. I loved it. Enjoyed it. I don't know if I'll read the whole thing again. The Dragonlance Chronicles I will read over and over again. But I am glad I read the whole thing. And very much enjoyed it. So that's it. That's my review of the Deathgate Cycle by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. Thank you for being a part of it. And, really, I do recommend going out and buying that book and buying anything by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. They're good people, and they write really fun stories. And of anything, they're great to study for just their characterization and the way they build their characters and define them. A lot of fun characters in this book, not just Haplo and Alfred. There's some really good ones. So that's it. Thank you so much. Again, please feel free to message me if you would like a copy of Simon Myth Chronicles Broken Chalice number 3. I'm working heavily on number 4 right now, and just excited to share this series with you all. It's a really fun story. So thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe and like, subscribe, all that business, and keep it psycho.